After conquering the coldest of climates in my Arctic challenge, it was only natural to try the other extreme. Without further ado, enter desert survival. I was looking forward to this challenge a lot more than the Arctic one. After all, the Badlands is one of my favorite Minecraft biomes of all time, and the desert is very reminiscent of that environment. Gone was the oppressive blue and white color palette, replaced instead with a ton of bright and vibrant colors with cool cacti and rodent skulls everywhere. However, hot is a lot easier than cold in Vintage Story. After all, you can't overheat and there are no thirst mechanics. I even looked for a thirst mod to make things harder, but to my surprise found absolutely nothing. But don't automatically assume this was a cakewalk. The desert presented plenty of its own challenges along the way. There were predators, drifters, cave-ins, crop failures, and many other pitfalls along my lengthy journey. If you have never seen me struggle to break into the Copper Age, this is a video for you. Sounds interesting? Join me for the sweaty adventure. We got a desert to conquer. The settings were as follows. Starting climate was set to hot, player lives was set to 1, the cave-in setting was turned on, color accurate world map was turned on, global temperature was set to scorching hot, global precipitation was set to hyper arid, class exclusive recipes were turned off, microblock chiseling was set to most cubic blocks. Malefactor was my class of choice. Cracked vessels provide a lot of hard to obtain materials in the worlds with limited resources, and Malefactor gives a boost to cracked vessel loot. The desert world greeted me with a massive sandstorm, reducing visibility to almost nothing.
No, I don't know what I expected.
Luckily, a luxury merchant's cart nearby provided the necessary reprieve. This was an important development. There would be no reeds to harvest in the desert, and thus no reed baskets and no reed chests. This would severely limit my inventory space early on, but there was a workaround. Fun fact, merchants' empty chests are usable by players, and merchants don't seem to mind when you do use them. Even better, merchants will allow you to sleep in their beds. Come to think of it, I have never seen them sleep, so maybe the beds are there just for decorations. My new friend Horace didn't know it yet, but he was getting a long-term squatter in his home. First order of business was to collect loose flint on the ground. Then I had to find some trees. Surprisingly, trees were not uncommon in the desert. I broke a few leaf blocks to get a few sticks going and nabbed an axe, which I immediately put to use to chop down a tree. I spent a little more time breaking the leaves to get a supply of sticks going and then nabbed a knife. I used said knife to harvest grass, which was also common in the desert. So far, this start has been infinitely easier than the Arctic one. As I made my way back to the merchant's cart, the sandstorm had finally passed, and I could examine the surrounding area. It was a desert alright. Since I couldn't place any objects or modify the cart in any way, I decided to make an attachment house instead. So I nabbed a shovel and gathered local sand. Sand was awful for building, but it was all I had at the moment. Once I built the perimeter, I threw down a rough door and made the wall 3 high just in case. It wasn't much, but it would do for now. I put down dry grass and some logs, and after rubbing sticks together, I had a lit fire. Too bad I had nothing to cook. So I deposited my wares into a chest courtesy of Horace, and started napping flint spears. My satiety was already below half, and food was on my mind. I went out hoping to kill just about anything, but as the sun was setting, I could not find anything to sink my teeth in. Plan B was to start collecting saguaro fruit, a type of local cactus. They were hardly worth the effort, but the choice was between that or death. Since hunting at night was a no-go, I used the bed kindly provided by Horace to pass the night. In the morning, I managed to find a pack of hyenas just outside of the cart, and I speared every last one of them. I did spare a pup though, I'm not a monster. This slaughter yielded me 30 pieces of bushmeat and a few pieces of fat to hold me over. It would cover my food needs for a little while. Thus, I started working towards a Copper Age. This would be a very long process, perhaps the longest ever. Everything was hinging on finding the cracked vessels. Ruins got a big overhaul in the latest update, so I had high hopes. Unfortunately, my hopes were quickly shattered. I ended up excavating every single ruin to the fullest extent, only to find out that the amount of cracked vessels seemed infinitely smaller compared to my Arctic challenge. Starting with the first ruin, no vessels, no bony soil. This was going to be a pattern. Ruin number 2 netted me a single piece of bony soil.
That's right, babe. I just bought this truck straight cash. And I got enough cigarettes to last me and my family for the rest of our lives. I'm rich, bitch!
Ruin 3 was empty. Ruin 4 was empty as well. Ruin 5 was an interesting one, however. It was a new variant with a creepy cellar and looked extremely suspect. Between the skeletons and restraining devices, it looked like a torture chamber. It happened to have a clay container full of rot. I grabbed the container along with its content. Furthermore, I found 13 pieces of bony soil, which made up for all other runes. And finally, there was a torch holder on the wall. Too bad there were no cracked vessels here either. It was getting dark, so I went home and slept through the night. In the morning, I decided to hunt and stumbled upon ibexes, only to find out they can pack a punch. Half of my health was gone in a single hit. They were certainly not to be taken lightly. I probably should have backed off, but I'm not a smart man. So I continued the hunt, with many close calls, as ibexes attempted to charge me from various angles. My haul ended up being awesome, with almost a full stack of red meat. Keeping myself fed in the desert was not nearly as challenging as in the Arctic. Next, I decided to gather a healthy supply of sticks from the local pines, and then I chopped them down for firewood. I would need a lot of firewood to constantly cook the meat, since cooking pot was nowhere on the radar. Having just a hotbar as my entire inventory sucked, but Horus provided me with a variety of containers to choose from for storage. Now that my food problems were solved for a good while, I got back to hunting for runes. Rune number 6, you guessed it, did not contain any vessels or any bony soil. Rune 7 was my first decent surface rune, with a farming vessel sitting ripe for the taking. I prayed to the temporal gods for some clay, but they weren't listening, and all I got was some feathers.
Whoa! This is worthless.
My consolation prize was 4 pieces of bony soil, so that was at least something. It was hella dark, so I returned to Horus's cart to offload my inventory and to sleep off yet another night. Next day, I was met with another dust storm, but it cleared up quickly. Rune number 8 had 4 pieces of bony soil, but no vessels. Rune 9 had no soil, but when digging around, I did score a cracked vessel. Buried vessels were surprisingly uncommon in the new update. The vessel dropped intact due to the Malefactor perk, and being severely limited on inventory, I took it with me to break later. Rune 10 had a tool vessel that dropped me a copper scythe, which wasn't all that helpful at the moment, but would be useful later. Rune 11, no vessels, and 3 pieces of soil. Rune 12 had only a single piece of bony soil. It was getting dark, so I returned home. I broke the forge vessel, and to my elation, it was about a half stack of blue clay. Pretty amazing development, but nowhere near enough for the technological transition. I started molding the clay to see how much this would amount to. First was the crucible, then a pickaxe mold. Next was the hammer mold. That left me with only one measly piece of blue clay. I still needed an anvil mold and an ingot mold to transition to copper. And of course, a cooking pot would have been real nice. Perhaps something I should have prioritized instead of other clay projects. They weren't much use to me at the moment. Back to rune scavenging, with rune 13 having nothing of value at all. Rune 14 had at least the decency to reward me with 4 pieces of bony soil. 15 was totally empty. Rune 16 had 3 pieces of soil and, more importantly, a foraged vessel. Would I get lucky and get clay from this one? And the answer was
No.
I moved to rune number 16, which was positively empty. 17 had 3 pieces of soil, 18 was empty. Rune 19 had a food vessel ripe for the taking. Too bad, that was one of the least useful vessel types to me. Another day passed with not much to show for it. I want to pretend like I did something exciting the next morning, but no, I was back to scouting for runes. One positive about my current predicament, copper ore was extremely easy to come by on the surface. Once I made the copper transition, getting my hands on copper ore would be trivial. Another exciting development was a string of extremely deep lakes to the west. These lakes offered an intriguing way of looking for ore. Diving these lakes would allow me to scout quickly and cover a lot of ground. But that was neither here nor there. I was nowhere near that point. Instead, more rune scavenging was on the menu. Rune 20 was empty though. Rune 21 was a little more exciting, with a tool vessel that dropped me a copper pickaxe and a copper shovel. If only I had gotten this copper pickaxe a little sooner, I could have bypassed making a pickaxe mold and saved some of the clay. Oh well, what's done is done. This rune also had an underground cellar with a farming vessel that dropped some flax fibers. Honestly, not a bad outcome. A few of those, and I would be able to craft a linen bag or 2. And boy, did I need those bags badly. Rune 22 was back to form by being totally empty. At this point, my food supplies were running low, so I got back to Horus, took out 6 flint spears out of storage, slept off the darkness, and set off to hunt. This time around, I decided to hunt gazelles. They didn't fight back at all and were easy pickings. However, they did have a tendency of being easily spooked. On the positive side, they were absolutely packed with red meat. I managed to get a lot of meat, and this would set me up for a long stretch. So I decided to take a break from ruin scavenging to do something equally as exciting, panning the bony soil.
Excuse me, is this Sarcasm 101?
No, it's Lamaze class from men named Arthur.
Oh, okay, sorry.
I'm kidding. It is Sarcasm 101. Be more gullible. Take any seat you want.
I had 36 pieces of soil to pan through. I was hoping to generate a few sellable items to get my economy going. The closest source of water was by the flat-top mountain nearby. A small mountain waterfall was emanating from one of the mountain sides. I got cracking on panning the soil. About halfway through the session, I had enough flax fibers panned to make my first linen bag. The extra 5 slots felt pretty goddamn amazing by this time. The panning session didn't yield anything earth-shattering. A couple of lore books, a couple of precious gems, some candles, copper spears, and a few gears. It was a reasonable haul, which I took home. Right under the mountain, I found an artisan merchant that bought both of my precious stones, netting me 19 gears. I was in business. At home, I had enough flax twine stashed away to craft an extra linen bag. My inventory had officially doubled. Unfortunately, that didn't move me any closer to the Copper Age. One way to expedite this transition was to utilize a treasure hunter merchant. I found one in the east. I was hoping he was carrying cracked vessels of correct variety. He had 2 different vessel types in stock, but not the ones I wanted. So it was back to the drawing board. Meanwhile, my house was showing cracks in its armor. The cart was doing absolutely nothing against the hyenas, and they could freely crawl under. Thus, they kept surprising me with sneaky ambushes. However, it was no time to mope around. Ruins were increasingly harder to come by and required further and further travel. Ruin 23 had a food vessel, which wasn't helping my situation. Ruin 24 ended up being empty. Ruin 25 was awesome in comparison, with 6 pieces of bony soil. Ruin 26 had 3 pieces of soil and an ore vessel, which was probably the least useful type. It did drop me a little bit of black coal, which was honestly the best outcome. It was getting dark, so I slept off the night by placing a straw bed on top of the ruin. In the morning, I pressed forward to ruin number 27, which was a dud. Ruin number 28 had 3 pieces of bony soil. Ruin 29 had another 3. Ruin 30 rewarded my milestone with nothing. Ruin 31 was empty as well. Ruin 32 had a seed vessel which dropped rice seeds, but farming was the last thing on my mind. Meanwhile, I encountered a furniture merchant on my route and saw a good deal on a copper lantern. Since crafting a lantern was a pipe dream at this time, it seemed like a good investment of 6 gears. Ruin 33 was once again totally void of any value. Ruin 34 had a tool vessel that dropped me a copper axe. Thanks, I guess. On the way back to my house, I encountered a cassava plant, the only naturally occurring crop I have seen thus far. I grabbed the seeds for later use. At home, I slept off the night and set off for another early morning hunt. However, the prey was nowhere to be found, and once again, I had to rely on saguaro fruit to sustain me along the way. Once I found a flock of gazelles, the copper spears made short work of them. And once I had a nice stack of meat, I went back to cook my haul. At home, I almost lost my hardcore attempt due to a hyena ambush. There was a whole family living under Horace's cart, a little too close for comfort. I decided to take care of this problem once and for all by slaying the entire pack. I still couldn't bring myself to kill the pup though. Hunger was solved for the time being, so I went ruin hunting. To no one's surprise, Ruin 35 had 1 piece of bony soil, and Ruin 36 was totally empty. Fuck my life. I slept off the night in another merchant's cart, and while planning my next steps, almost ate it again, this time due to a drifter ambush. Narrowly escaping another death, I proceeded to Ruin 37, which was empty. And so was number 38. Ruin 39 had 1 measly piece of bony soil. 40 was empty too. I was getting frustrated by this process. Something had to change real quick, because I was ready to quit. It was time for plan B, which was panning for clay. Before that though, I realized I had another technological hurdle to overcome. Even if I had enough clay for all the molds, I still needed tongues to smelt. I had no access to reeds or vines, thus no rope to make tongues. It was time to check the treasure hunter's inventory. I was in luck this time. He had a farming vessel in stock. Forage vessels would have been ideal as they can drop both clay and reeds, but in the absence of that, farming vessels would do. I bought 2 vessels and broke them outside. To my elation, the first vessel happened to drop me some reeds. I flipped them into a rope and then rope into tongues. The second vessel also didn't disappoint, as it dropped me a bunch of flax twine, which I immediately flipped into 2 more linen bags. Perhaps my luck was finally turning. Next, a big panning session was in order, but before that, I needed to prepare. So I went out hunting for food. Then, I chopped a bunch of trees for firewood. When I made it back home, I cooked it all on 3 campfires. I finally realized that I could utilize more than 1 campfire at a time to expedite the process. Not sure why it took me this long to learn this trick. While checking on my food, I once again suffered a massive ambush. Apparently, drifters could also freely squeeze under the cart.
Watch out for your cornhole, bud.
I tried sleeping off the night, but even in the morning, I had to wage war on the drifters to defend my home. I really needed a better place to live. After killing the drifters, I dug out a batch of sand and set off towards the lakes. Here, I decided to build a little bunker. However, the surrounding sand proved to be extremely unstable, and I suffered a total collapse of my bunker along with the FPS. Nevertheless, I rebuilt the bunker with a dirt foundation after learning the lesson. It was time to pan. I panned through the day, I panned through the night, I panned through a temporal storm, I panned through bony soil, and I continued panning afterwards. Eventually, I started to experience issues with the drifters swimming under and messing with me. So, I decided to bail, but almost died to another drifter ambush. I sprinted to the nearest merchant and slept through the night. The panning session only netted me 11 clay. This was not enough. So I decided to check the treasure hunter's inventory in hopes that his restock included foraged vessels. First, I had to travel around to see if I could sell anything of value. An artisan trader bought one of my gems for 8 gears. To my excitement, the treasure hunter did stock foraged vessels this time around. There were 6 gears a pop. I only had 12 gears, so I bought 2. The first one dropped honeycomb. Yikes. As I trembled in fear, the second one dropped 12 pieces of clay. Still not enough. This is when luck turned on my side. On the way back to my base, I ran into a ruin with another foraged vessel. Luckily, it dropped me another 10 pieces of blue clay. Combined, I had 33 pieces of blue clay, enough to finally leave the Stone Age behind. I was so freaking thrilled. At home, I finally installed a secondary door behind me to avoid any surprises. Once my cornhole felt safe, I formed an anvil mold, and then proceeded to form 2 ingot molds, a cooking pot, and a single bowl. I was back down to 0 clay, but in a good place to progress. Next, I needed to start a bunch of pit kilns. The copper size I scored earlier from a vessel came in handy. I had plenty of sticks and wood and did not need to gather extra. Before long, the pits were lit and I moved on to making a small charcoal pit. I started that up as well, and now it was just a matter of time. To spend time wisely, I went gazelle hunting. Then, I cooked the last batch of campfire meat. I followed that up with a little route to collect surface copper bits scattered everywhere. My pits still weren't done, however, so I took it easier for once and AFK'd until the nightfall and then slept off the night. In the morning, everything had finished and I was ready to cast my first copper tools. But first, I cooked up a pot full of red meat. And finally, the crucible heated up sufficiently to do my first cast of a copper hammer, a pickaxe, and 2 ingots. Next, I dug out the now finished charcoal pit and proceeded to start hunting for surface copper deposits. I had a million of those already marked on the map, with the first one being just inches away from Horace's cart. Once I had enough copper, I smelted the anvil along with 2 more ingots. I was now officially in the Copper Age. I crafted a forge from the cobblestone and started to heat up the first batch of copper ingots. I smithed the copper saw as my first tool. Ultimately, I was ready to move out and get a place of my own, but I needed storage to make that a reality. Next, I made a set of shears, 4 copper nails, and another pickaxe. I then made a copper shovel and a prospecting pick. Outside of the cart, the first pine seedlings grew into beautiful adult trees. I didn't admire them for long because it was time to move out. First order of business was to collect a bunch of sticks using my brand new shears. Then I chopped down pines for wood and made planks with the saw. This allowed me to craft a hefty amount of ladders. My game plan was to settle on top of the flat top mountain in the distance. The idea behind that was twofold. It was a little too hot to grow most crops at default elevation. They would be stunted due to sheer heat of the desert. The flat top mountain was almost at the world's height and offered significantly cooler temperatures to grow crops. The second reason, it was simply a badass location. So I built up a sand pillar to the top, found a good spot to dig down, and started working through the massive granite mountain. Once at the bottom, I started digging sideways. With the 2 tunnels combined and a bunch of ladders, I now had a shortcut to quickly go up and down the mountain. At the top, I crafted 2 double chests and deposited my possessions. I made another trek to Horace's cart, grabbed all of my gear, cleared out all of the chests, and took them to the top of the mountain. Here, I built a pretty basic enclosure for my things. Nothing fancy. I had a massive build planned out later down the road. Next, I crafted a bucket and descended down to the local waterfall to grab a water source. I took it up the mountain and filled a trench full of water. I was ready to start farming. On the mountain, I found a surprising amount of sunflowers, so I grabbed every single one. I then had a smithing session where I made more nails to expand my storage and to make a copper hoe, which I used to till the soil around my new farm. I then made wood fencing to place around the perimeter. Might not seem necessary, but there was a surprising amount of rabbits and chickens all over the mountaintop. I suppose the spawn conditions were just right for that to be the case. My first crop of sunflowers was planted. Speedy harvest was not really in the cards. Low fertility soil was all I had, and it would be a while until farming was going to pay off. I also found a pomegranate tree and cut all of the branches to acquire tree cuttings. The most surprising thing I found at the mountaintop was a massive deposit of fire clay and another deposit of blue clay. If only I knew of its existence earlier, would have saved me a lot of time. Nonetheless, this was an exciting discovery and made steel an achievable goal in the 100-day span. Next, I planted the pomegranate cuttings, and in retrospect, this was a waste of time. They never produced a single fruit. I then made another exciting discovery. There were about a dozen acacia shrubs scattered throughout. None of them were full trees, but if I could score a seed or two, that would mean I could potentially produce leather. Acacia logs could be made into tannin in the absence of oaks. In the end, I acquired 2 acacia seeds, which I planted to grow into full trees. I also planted whatever pine seeds I had on hand. I would have a beautiful forest on top of the mountain, eventually. It was getting dark, but I still stepped out for a hunt, as I was running out of sustenance. During the hunt, I took an opportunity to chop down a bunch of pines as well. I needed the wood for cooking and crafting planks, and extra pine seeds were going towards the mountain forest. With extra planks, I crafted more fences, which went towards another plot, as I had few more seeds to test out. I had no idea what was worth growing, so I was just going to plant everything and find out. I had a bit of rice, some cassava, and 2 cabbage seeds. I planted them and moved on to the next step of my conquest. The next step was to score some saltpeter to enhance the low fertility soil. I found a cave under the mountain and descended down to scope it out. I did not find saltpeter down here, but I did find my first 1.19 underground ruin. It was full of decorative objects and a few pieces of notable loot. Another torch holder, a cool looking schematic, an ornate golden shield, and a blackguard helmet. There was also other decorative clutter here. I went back to my base to drop it off and then went back to cave diving. Most caves were obviously empty until I found another interesting cave containing another ruin. However, I was getting bodied by locusts. There was clearly a locust nest down here, and with my level of protection, it was time to bail. In another cave, I found a large deposit of brown coal. So I grabbed a ton of it and then got horribly lost on the way out. Eventually, I found a sandy section that almost buried me alive, but it did create an escape route. In the morning, I continued scouting for caves. While doing that, I found a cracked vessel with 8 flax twine and 9 reeds. Flax twine was highly appreciated. I spotted a deep cave and descended down to scout it out. Not sure what was going through my head going down with low health, but it did pay off. I saw a lot of saltpeter on the walls. As I was trying to locate the exit, I saw a familiar glow of locusts. This was getting a little too spooky, but once again I was hopelessly lost. While moving from a dead end to a dead end, I found yet another ruin. There was not a ton of notable loot down here, but I did get a bunch of rot and 2 more torch holders. I also grabbed the clay container and a few clay bowls, along with dry grass and firewood. Now, if only I could find an exit. This was a massive cave system with a ton of saltpeter, but also massively hazardous. Eventually, I spotted the tunnel used to descend down and escape with my life. This was the least advisable thing I have done to date. Nonetheless, I was now a proud owner of saltpeter. Furthermore, I suddenly had enough rot for 2 wooden barrels. This meant in 20 days I would have compost. Compost was awesome for growing sunflowers. Meanwhile, saltpeter was the best I had, so I applied it to my fields. Most plants were growing fine, but cabbage was already heat stressed. There was little point in continuing growing the cabbage. Regardless, crop growth was extremely slow. I was nowhere near my first harvest. Next, I trekked towards the deep lakes to the west. I was ready for some explorative diving in hopes of striking gold, and by gold I mean tin. I prospected around the lakes to get a general idea of the potential. The results were less than promising. Only very poor amounts of iron were showing, and there was a minuscule amount of tin. But there was certainly a chance to get lucky. First, I jumped into one of the bigger lakes. The submerged underground cave system was absolutely massive. I had to constantly dig small sideway tunnels to catch my breath. Here, I discovered an incredibly annoying 1.19 bug. If you suffered any amount of suffocation damage, the hurt animation would continuously play out even when you were no longer taking damage. Only fully exiting and restarting the world would fix that bug. My first underwater find was borax. I had no use for it yet, but I did make a mental note. Shortly, I found a small amount of tin, but got hit with a temporal storm right after. The tin ore would have to wait a little. Once the temporal storm passed, I came out of my hiding hole and assessed the situation. The amount of tin ore was pretty minuscule, as the prospecting data suggested. Generally, I like to bulldoze through the Bronze Age straight to iron, and perhaps this amount would be enough. I continued to dive the smaller lakes and found even more tiny pockets of tin. The big break came in one of these smaller lakes. I found a solid line of outward-facing iron ore. While the copper transition took me a million years, the iron transition could potentially be the fastest one ever. There was nothing interesting or promising in the rest of the lakes though. Instead of doing the math, I ran home to smelt whatever tin bronze I had. I stopped by a few copper deposits on the way home because I needed a lot of copper for the anvil. When I made it home, I smelted a tin bronze pick right away. However, I was just a few nuggets short of making an anvil, so I had to make the trek all the way back to the lakes. It was a long run, and as far as I could tell, I mined out all of the tin, but I needed a very small amount to move forward. So I crossed my fingers and once again dove deep into the deep blue water. It didn't happen right away, but eventually I found another strip of tin ore in one of the bigger lakes. This would be enough for the anvil, with plenty remaining for other uses. By the end, I ended up with 48 nuggets of tin. It was time to run home through the murky darkness of the desert. Shortly, I had 900 units of tin bronze cooking in the crucible. Next, I poured molten bronze into the mold and left it to cool. I was short on food, so I went out to hunt at the crack of dawn. Now that I had a cooking pot, hunting was fairly manageable, as I only need 24 pieces of red meat for a full pot of highly satiating grub. With my belly full of gazelle, I grabbed my tin bronze pick and ran back to the lakes for another dive. I found the iron patch and started digging. There was no shortage of the stuff down here. I was set for the rest of the game. Once my temporal stability started to drop a bit low, I emerged from the murky water with a big load. On the way back, I stopped by a few building materials merchants to see if they had any fire clay bricks. I had a big fire clay deposit at home, but I wanted to save it for a refractory furnace to make steel. Unfortunately, none of them had any bricks, so I made it home and tapped into my fire clay deposit. I made fire clay bricks and stuffed them into the pits. I loaded these pits with dry grass, sticks, firewood, and let it cook. Now that I was entering the Iron Age, I had 3 big projects on my mind. A quad windmill setup with Helve hammers, a steel furnace, and an aesthetic place to live. First things first, I went on a scouting mission to find resin on the desert pines. Luckily, pines weren't all that rare and I was finding resin regularly. When I came back home, I grabbed the now cooked fire clay bricks, crafted 4 bloomeries, stuffed them full of iron and charcoal, and lit those suckers up. 4 bloomeries cooking. Now that was a nice sight. My demand for charcoal was about to go through the roof though, so I ran out to grab an inventory full of pine wood. I made sure to spare the trees with the resin on them. I would need a metric ton of resin in the future. The charcoal pit wasn't exceedingly large, but for the time being, it would do. Once that was done, I made sure to plant all of the pine seeds I got from tree cutting. I couldn't wait any longer, so I broke down the bloomery stew full of hot blooms and got working on making my first ingots. Once I had 4 ingots, I slapped them down in the furnace and cooked them up. In a typical fashion, my first iron item was a hammer, but then I switched to making iron plugs. I kept smithing them until I had 10 total. I wanted to lay the foundation for my main build and to build 4 windmill towers. Thus, I was ready to get into stone quarrying. But before setting off for a massive stone quarrying expedition, I had to go hunting yet again. This hunt did not go as smoothly as the previous ones. I was really struggling to locate any gazelles, and by the time I found some, it was already dark. I was forced to hunt with a torch lighting the way. Eventually, the pot of meat was cooking and I decided to check on my plants. The pomegranate tree cuttings were still wooden stumps, the sunflowers were still only on stage 4 out of 12, and the rice/cassava field wasn't showing any signs of progress. I found a few soybean seeds in a cracked vessel during my hunt, so I slapped them in the low fertility soil to grow as well. I also reapplied the saltpeter to the fields. It wasn't going to help the nitrogen-hungry sunflowers a ton, but it was still something. Needless to say, these fields were not going to feed me anytime soon. Other homesteading tasks included digging up the charcoal pit and firing up 3 more bloomeries full of iron. I smithed a few more iron tools, a pickaxe, a shovel, and a finishing chisel. Finally, I was ready to get some polished rock. Sandstone was the main stone I was going to use this time around, so I trekked to the yellow portion of the map. A cool thing about this desert world, it had a variety of strata easily accessible. There were a lot of colors to work with. Once I made it to the sandstone, I used the splitter plugs to shear off large slabs of stone. The presence of sand really slowed down this process as the sand fell under gravity, burying my operation. I should have gone deeper underground, a technique I started practicing later. The night was calm, with no rift activity, so I continued working through the darkness, aided by my copper lantern. Eventually, I got bored of rock quarrying and journeyed home to process the rock. At this stage, I had no idea how large my build would end up being. Otherwise, I would have stayed behind to do more. At home, I immediately smithed a set of copper nails to craft the chests needed for all the extra building blocks. Once I had room for storage, I equipped the finishing chisel in my main hand with a hammer in my offhand and got to work. This process took me all the way into the morning when I started figuring out the dimensions on my future base. Look, if you thought this was going to be a modest build, you must have not watched any of my other videos. The nightfall brought a lot of annoying drifters with it, so I had to bunker down and sleep off the darkness. In the morning, I continued the foundation. By the time I finished the 4th layer of the foundation, I started putting in the foundation floor. I came nowhere near completing it though. Clearly, I would need about 10 times more polished sandstone than I thought. So that is exactly what I did. I set off for another sandstone quarrying mission. Nothing notable happened on this mission, despite it taking a really long time. And once I had about 20 rock slabs, I trekked back home. Once I was back, I smithed a bunch of finishing chisels and got cracking on the slabs. Somewhere along the process, I ran out of food and had to take a break to snag a few gazelles. By the time I came back, my first few pines grew to maturity along with my very first beautiful acacia. The sunflowers were looking pretty good too, about 2/3 done. Well, there ain't no rest for the wicked, so I got back to finishing the floor of the foundation. Patience is a virtue, and after a while, the floor of the foundation was finished. Now, I was ready to build the windmill towers on each of the 4 corners. I didn't particularly care about the aesthetics of the towers at the moment. I just wanted something functional, and eventually I would make them look a bit nicer. For now, they would just be 4 squares. The completed tower wasn't anything fancy to look at, but the top went all the way into the clouds, which was kind of neat. Of course, I still had 3 identical towers to build. The process was not terribly exciting, but at least the views from the top were nice. And just like that, the 2nd tower was finished, followed by the 3rd. As I was working on the last tower, a temporal storm hit and I hid in the hidey hole. The exit from the said hidey hole was a bit spooky this time around because I just happened to be under a rift. Regardless, I was completely out of polished sandstone to finish the 4th tower, so I decided to move on for now. It would be a while still until I had enough materials to transform every single tower into a windmill anyway. This process would involve a lot of trading, as my only source of linen sheets in reasonable quantities would be clothing and commodities merchants. My future would involve a lot of mindless running between different traders. I visited Horace again, but he did not want to buy any of my wares. Not even for the old time's sake. A bunch of tall pines that I planted earlier stood tall around his cart, and I cut them down for wood. I would need all of this wood for axles, rotors, Helve hammerheads, and other automation components. The commodities merchants refused to hook me up with linen on this route. During the night, I experienced my first desert rainfall, which was a relaxing experience. I missed the gentle ambience of rain. While the rainfall was nice, my trading was going poorly. Nobody was buying anything, and nobody was selling anything, until the last available clothing trader hooked me up with 8 linen sheets. Combined with the linen I already had, it would be enough for a 3-sail windmill, which would be enough to generate the kind of power I would need. At home, I checked on my grow up. 3 pomegranate saplings took root while the other 4 died. The sunflowers were still stuck on stage 8 and the other field was not looking too hot either. Well, carnivore diet it was. I got cooking on the windmill components. I crafted a rotor, a bunch of gears, 3 sets of sails, and 22 axles. I placed the rotor on top of the tower and slapped the sails on the rotor. The windmill came alive. Then I ran an axle shaft through the middle of the tower underneath the foundation. Under the foundation, I was going to run the shaft all the way to the middle of the platform, where the Helve hammer setup would eventually reside. I made a temporary entrance on the side of the foundation for ease of access to my utilities. Around this time, I was starting to realize the fat would be the second biggest limiting factor in my quest for the wind dominance. I would need a lot of fat to run the axles all the way to the center of the platform. So I grabbed 6 copper spears and set off for another big hunting session. This meant killing close to 20 gazelles. I also stopped by marked pines to collect the resin that now resurfaced after the initial harvest. During this outing, I found some onion seeds in the cracked vessel. They had up to 40-degree heat tolerance, so made another good candidate to plant. By the time I came home with all of the fat in the universe, I started crafting Helve hammer components. I crafted the Helve hammer base, followed by smithing the Helve hammer head, and then made the Helve hammer arm and a toggle. I figured out the exact center of the platform with some dirt. Then I slapped the anvil in the middle and put my first Helve hammer together. After figuring out the gearing and the routing, I ran downstairs to find a little drifter haven. Drifters in my basement would be a recurring issue. After disposing of the unwanted squatters, I finished the routing of the axles and put in the last corner gear. Once I ran upstairs, I saw the Helve hammer come alive. One Helve hammer was just a start, which meant I had to repeat the exact same process for the other 3. Of course, I had no linen to make sails and no rusty gears to buy them either. My plan to make money would involve the familiar trading technique from the Arctic Challenge video. This involved making tin bronze tools and selling them to building materials merchants. That meant I would need a lot of tin bronze ingots. So I started forming more molds. I stuffed them into the firing pits and lit the fuse. Next, I made yet another temporary enclosure around the center. This would be my smithing room for the time being. While the molds were cooking, I stepped out to mine copper ore. I had a basically infinite supply of surface copper ore marked on my map. At night, the molds got done cooking and I smelted my first batch of tin bronze ingots. While they were cooling off, I crafted a quern, grinded a few bones, threw the onion seeds on a new plot, and fortified the soil with the bone meal. My other plot with sunflowers was barely progressing, but the soybeans were doing well. Meanwhile, the first batch of ingots cooled off and I smelted the second batch. There was no time like the present to start the mass production of tin bronze tools, so I threw a bunch of ingots on the forge and heated them up to temp. Once they were hot, I utilized my Helve hammer to speed up the production while smithing myself on the side. I was focusing on the tools that were valuable to building materials merchants: saws, axes, and hammers. I also smithed a few sets of tools to sell to the treasure hunter merchants: folkses, pickaxes, and shovels. Once I had a few sets of both, I took off to do a large trading route. The idea was to craft the tools as needed to save on bag space. Unfortunately, the parts were still too hot to craft without tongs equipped, so I had to make a little detour to cool them off in the waterfall. The first 2 merchants only bought 1 tool each. The next 2 merchants bought 2 tools each. And the closing merchant sold me 7 linen sheets. The next 2 merchants bought 2 more tools each, and the commodities merchant sold me 16 flax twines. I bought another 12 flax twines from the next commodities merchant and ran out of gears. It did put me at 14 linen sheets, good enough for another windmill. I was, however, broke. I had to wait for merchants to restock anyway. Thus, there was nothing better to do than to trek back home through a desert storm. Once back, I wanted to jump on the windmill production, but realized I was short on resin, fat, and my cooking pot was totally empty. Thus, I set out on a trip to get all 3. However, I was striking out on finding any resin or any gazelles. I even had to rely on the old trick of eating saguaro fruit to stay afloat. Eventually, I did locate some prey and started hunting. However, my next meal could not wait, so I had to start a fire in the middle of the desert to cook. Once my tummy was full of protein, I hunted down every gazelle I saw. I still needed resin, but had to hunt for it in the middle of the night, aided by the lantern. I visited all the old resin spots and found some new ones on the way. In the end, I made it back to my base with 40 pieces of fat and 11 pieces of resin. I also had a staggering amount of meat, 6.5 stacks to be exact. Unfortunately, I had no real way of preserving it, so it was destined to rot. Rot, however, was a good source for compost, which could power my sunflowers in the future, so not entirely useless. Speaking of sunflowers, the first batch was nearly grown, only half a year to get here. At night, I was using the Helve hammer to work on some iron blooms for the next Helve hammer head. Meanwhile, I was busy crafting the components of the next Helve hammer and the windmill. While trying to place the sails, I suffered my first high altitude fall, losing nearly 3/4 of my life pool. Wouldn't be my last, that's for sure. Shortly, the sails were put on the windmill, the downstairs routing was complete, and the second Helve hammer came alive. Not having to smith my own tools by hand sure felt nice. I could have probably stopped here, this setup was already decently fast, but I'm not a fan of half measures. At this point, I was starting to think about steel production as well. So I went to dig out all of the fire clay on the mountain to take stock. In the end, I had 10.5 stacks of fire clay, which would be plenty enough for a single furnace, but definitely not 2. This put me on a trajectory to make 48 steel ingots by the end. Meanwhile, all of my meat was already rotten. So I crafted a few more barrels and sealed the rot inside for 20 more days. It was time to start thinking about a pulverizer. I crafted the frame and the 2-pounders. Then I used my Helve hammers to smith an iron plate to make a toggle and the 2-pounder caps. I smelted a batch of 10 copper ingots because I needed to make copper plates for hopper and chutes. I also chiseled my copper anvil back into 8 copper bars. I didn't need the copper anvil anymore, so it made sense to get some use out of it. While the ingots were cooling, I decided to do some homesteading. I grabbed a pair of shears and trimmed every single leaf on the 2 acacia trees that were now fully grown. Then I chopped them down for firewood. This got me 18 acacia seeds, which I immediately replanted. I was excited to have my very own acacia mini forest on the mountaintop. Next came the long expedition to gather all the necessary components for steel. First was the bauxite. I must be lucky because I have never struggled to find bauxite, this world not being an exception. There was a large bauxite section to the northwest. Once I arrived, I mined 6 stacks of bauxite stone. Second, the chalk stone from the white section of the map. Chalk and limestone are something I see people complain about a lot, but in this world it was plentiful. Chalk turned into lime, which I would use for leatherworking. Third was the stop to fish out borax I found ages ago from the murky and dark lakes to the west. Fourth was the quartz. Quartz, of course, is never hard to find in this game. It was a little slower to mine, however, than the rest of the materials. But in the end, I had my 6 stacks. Fifth was olivine. I managed to find 2 different locations on my map with olivine deposits. Olivine was not strictly necessary, but it would help me craft tier 2 refractory bricks, which were sturdier. Eventually, my mining pick broke, but I already had over 4.5 stacks of olivine. My inventory was filled up to the brim with goodies, and it was time to head home. Once I was home, I routed all the necessary components of the hopper system. This way, the pulverizer would run autonomously. Then, I loaded a small chest full of things needed to be pulverized. I checked that the collection hopper was working and let the pulverizer do its thing. Meanwhile, it was finally time to reap what I sowed. In my case, it was a full harvest of my very own sunflower crop. It felt like a very special occasion, and the results were 4.5 stacks of sunflower seeds. Soybeans were ready too. I only had 6 of those planted, but at least they grew quickly compared to everything else. Neither the rice or cassava were ready, but it would buy me a lot of free time not spent on hunting. Finally, I needed a cellar to store food. Considering how hot this world was, I was going to take advantage of a cellar with a clay storage vessel on the inside. Once I placed all my food inside, I realized that long-term storage of crops would not be as big of a problem as I thought. Another temporal storm wasted a bit of my time. Once it passed, I constructed yet another farming strip to the left of my base. I tilled the soil and replanted all of the sunflowers. On the old sunflower soil, I would eventually replant rice and soybeans. They both require K to grow, and the soil was extremely K-rich from the double application of saltpeter. After all of that, it was time to gather all the crushed components from the chest underneath the pulverizer. Next, I decided it was time for another windmill expansion. This would involve another long trading route, first to sell and then to buy. The artisan merchant bought a precious gem, and one of the treasure hunters merchants bought a shovel. The building materials merchant did me a solid and bought 3 tools for 14 gears. Then a luxury merchant bought another gem for 10 gears. My old pal Horace bought 2 books. The first books I ever managed to sell to a merchant. There are just so many different varieties and they never want the ones you have. Suddenly I had 48 gears to my name. A pretty good haul. I started to check the merchants to buy linen. The first commodities merchant absolutely hooked my ass up with 7 linen sheets and 20 flax twines. Together, this translated to 12 linen sheets. Ruslan, you are a goddamn legend.
Hey man, you his boss?
Yes?
Well, he's a legend.
On the way back, I stopped by a building materials merchant who bought yet another full set of tools. During the trading route, I kept religiously checking all of the resin spots. I ended up with 8 pieces, which would see me through another windmill. The next morning, I set off on an early hunt. I had a lot of hunting to do that day. You have already seen this process. Copper spears plus a local gazelle flock equals fat. I stopped once I had 15 fat, since I had another 10 at base. Next came a cadence of crafting all of the components for a Helve hammer, setting the rotor up with sails, and routing the axles underneath the foundation. Unfortunately, I ran out of fat for the axles before finishing and had to step out to get more. I was not going to be picky this time around, so I ran out and killed the first pack of hyenas I saw. On the way back, I ran into a ruin with an underground section that contained an iron door. This was a very cool find. I would need an iron door for the refractory furnace, and this saved me a lot of iron and headache of crafting it. There was some decorative stuff here as well, along with some fancier clothes and a piece of forlorn armor, which was whatever. I did not intend to do anything with it anyway. When I got home, I had enough fat to craft all of the gears and the axles I needed to get the third Helve hammer rolling. Next, I crafted tier 2 refractory bricks with fire clay, crushed bauxite, olivine, and quartz. In the end, I made 256 bricks. Of course, the raw refractory bricks would need to be fired in the pits, so I started stacking them up in the holes. There was no shortage of grass on my mountaintop, and with the help of a scythe, I soon had all the pits filled. The easiest way to get sticks required a run outside, ensuring the smaller pines scattered all over the place. Once I had enough sticks, I stacked them in the pits as well. The firewood was easy to come by, and once I had the firing pits separated with a sandbar to prevent a forest fire, I lit all of the pits. Next, I made a trip to the deep abyss of the lake to mine more iron. I needed a lot of iron to make steel. Luckily, there was still plenty to be had down here. I didn't stop until my sanity almost dropped to 0, but that amounted to 4.5 stacks of iron chunks. Plenty for my needs for the time being. At home, I fired up 3 bloomeries to cover the first steel batch. Next, I started grinding chalk to make lime. I was about to make mortar for the refractory blocks. Once the lime was ground in the mortar, I started cooking it in the fire pit. Meanwhile, I grabbed the finished refractory bricks and combined quicklime and sand in the barrel to make mortar. I was at the stage where I had all the necessary components for the steel furnace. I started by crafting the 6 grates with the refractory bricks and the mortar. Then I made 2 stone coffin sections. I followed by grinding borax and making the 2 lid sections. Of course, I already had an iron door. Lastly, I crafted the rest of the refractory bricks for the build. I was ready to build a furnace, but it was getting dark and the rift activity was high. So I finally upgraded my sleeping accommodations by crafting an actual bed. It was worth sacrificing a linen sheet for that purpose. I put the bed in a Helve hammer room. I don't know how my character managed to sleep with all that noise. That's pretty metal if you ask me. In the morning, it was time to build. First, I laid out the foundation for the furnace. Then, I chiseled the opening for the charcoal chamber. I followed it up by placing the grates and the coffin. This enabled the furnace outline, and I followed the game's instructions to finish the furnace. I slapped down the iron door, finished the chimney, and the furnace was done. I followed with a Helve hammer session where I smithed 16 iron blooms for the first batch. One advantage of building at this height and the desert in general were the incredible wind speeds. Hurricanes were incredibly common up here. So it took me no time at all to get 16 iron ingots made. Once they were made, I stuffed them in the coffin with a bunch of charcoal. Then I loaded the oven with even more charcoal and lit the pile. The furnace was officially cooking. This was a big technological achievement for my desert world. I honestly did not expect to be here. I built up the furnace a little more to make it more aesthetically pleasing and to make interacting with it a little easier. Now it was just a matter of time. A lot of time. There was one more thing to do before I could switch gears entirely, and that was to make another charcoal pit. My demand for coal was not going away. I decided to sacrifice some of the mountaintop forest for this purpose. Eventually, I had to step outside as well to get more wood. Once I had a decently sized pit, I lit it up and left it to cook. There was one more steel making task on the agenda. I wanted to fire a big batch of bloomeries to get the rest of the iron blooms for steel. I was planning 3 batches of steel for 48 total bars. Plus, I needed a bit of extra to keep making iron tools. However, I did not want to sacrifice the rest of my fire clay to make bricks. So instead, I visited the merchants. In retrospect, I did not need to be this conservative with the fire clay. I managed to sell a precious stone to a luxury merchant, and I saw plus a copper bracelet to the building materials merchant. I then spent these gears to acquire 56 fire clay bricks. When I got home, I crafted the bloomeries, stuffed them with iron and charcoal, and lit them up. Next, I gathered the charcoal from the now finished fire pit and reloaded the steel furnace with another 32 charcoal. Once that was done, I used my Helve hammers to craft replacement tools. Furthermore, I needed 6 copper spears as all of mine broke over time due to the hunting demands. It took no time at all with my Helve hammer setup. Now, I wanted to try something I had never done before. I had a lot of chickens and rabbits that accidentally fell into a hole I dug out when mining for stone. I was going to attempt to raise chickens. However, I had no idea how effective the idea was going to be. I built a fenced area around the exit hole, corralled the animals into the pen, and disposed of the rabbits. In the end, I ended up with 6 hens and 1 rooster. I placed empty feeders into the pen, put a bunch of hen boxes in there as well, and left the chickens to their own devices. In retrospect, it was a waste of time. I never got any value out of them, just like I never got any value out of the pomegranate trees. Another small batch of soybeans was coming up for harvest, while cassava proved to be an incredibly slow crop, not worth its salt. Next, I decided to start on the leatherworking. I disconnected one of the Helve hammers temporarily and put in a quern instead to grind the chalk into lime. While it was grinding, I crafted a bunch of barrels and filled them up with water utilizing the source water block that I placed nearby. Once they were filled, I started making tannin in some of the barrels utilizing the acacia logs. In other barrels, I dissolved lime to make lime water. Once I had lime water, I added hides to the barrels and sealed those up as well. This marked an important stage in my desert adventure. Most of my long-term homesteading projects were complete. I finally had time to work on my build. That meant I would need building materials. So I set on a very long expedition to acquire polished stone. It was back to rock quarrying. First, I needed to acquire even more sandstone. I went to the yellow section one more time. This time, I went deeper underground to avoid dealing with collapsed sand. This expedited the process considerably, but I was having issues with the drifters invading my personal space. At some point, I was badly hurt and had to call it quits. By the time I made it home, the weak tannin was done cooking, and I added even more acacia logs into the barrels to make strong tannin. I then added processed hides into weak tannin and sealed those up. Meanwhile, I lined up all of the sandstone slabs in a line. Before I got down to chiseling, I did another round of shearing the acacias, after which I cut a few down to make more tannin. I was also all out of lime, so I made another trip to get some chalk. With these materials, I started cooking more tannin and made more lime water to soak even more leather. The leather production was in full swing now. Once that was done, I started chiseling the slabs. It was a long session, and in the end, I ended up with over 50 stacks of polished sandstone. After I was finished, I brewed more tannin and shuffled around the leather into their proper barrels. I gathered the soybeans and the rice and planted them once again into the still incredibly K-rich soil. Then I got to building. I finished the last tower that was abandoned halfway. By the time I was finished, I realized I was still short on charcoal. So I stepped outside to collect resin from the pines and to harvest a whole inventory worth of wood. I cut the woods into logs and stuffed another charcoal pit. I was a little short on wood, so once again I sacrificed my own pines to finish the job. To compensate, I planted more seedlings to keep the forest growing and expanding. By this time, weak tanning was done, and I put my hides into the strong tannin. Just 4.5 days left for my first leather batch. I also got my very first harvest of onions. It was a small amount, but all the crops were adding up. I would not need to hunt unless it was about getting fat. Speaking of fat, it was time for the last windmill. But first, I needed to buy the last set of linen. The temporal storm hit, but I did not feel like waiting it out. I figured as long as I remained mobile, I should be okay. Plus, I got to hang out with Dave a little. So I ran from merchant to merchant and checked their inventories. Both of the commodity merchants had a small amount of flax twine, but it only added up to 4 linen sheets. I checked every other merchant and was getting desperate until the very last clothing merchant hooked me up with the rest of the sheets. Now it was time to go hunting for the last time. I checked all of the pines for resin and then hunted all through the day deep into the night. Once I had 31 pieces of fat, I deemed that enough and went back. I followed the typical routine of crafting the Helve hammer components, placing the rotor, adding the sails, and routing the axles. Unfortunately, the drifters in the basement had other ideas. I waited for some of them to clear out, cleared out the rest myself, and tried routing the axles. Unfortunately, this routing had to be much more awkward and lengthy due to how congested it was getting downstairs. I ran out of axles prematurely. I did a quick detour to take out my frustration on some hyenas and stopped by a pine to get resin. I crafted the last gear and slapped it on the corner connecting the two axles. And there it was, a quad windmill and a quad Helve hammer setup. This took a lot of effort. I was going to put this setup to use right away. I spent the entire night working on blooms and went through my entire iron supply. In the morning, I was greeted by an army of drifters, but I had no time for them. My first batch of steel was complete. I broke the coffin and grabbed the steel blooms. The first firing created a few damaged bricks on the furnace and they had to be replaced. Even with tier 2 bricks, I had more breakage than I anticipated. Regardless, once I replaced them, I loaded the coffin with a fresh batch of iron, stuffed the furnace full of coal, and got cooking on batch number 2. Next, I dug out a charcoal batch out of the ground. My first batch of leather was done, so I crafted 4 leather bags to replace the linen ones. Remember when I had no bags at all?
Pepperidge Farm remembers.
I checked on my chickens from afar, not wanting to spook them. I saw a few eggs and one hen nursing the hen box, but I did not see any baby chicks. The fruit trees continued to be useless and cassava was yet to fully mature. Needless to say, chickens, fruit trees, and cassava plants were all officially failed experiments. I had enough homesteading for a lifetime, so I finally got to building my new house. First, I wanted to build the basic shape. This meant building the 4 walls to determine the dimensions. They were not going to be fancy at this point. Detailing would come much later. I tackled the front wall first with a tall 3x7 entrance. Then I built the side wall. Once they were both finished, I repeated this process to create a basic box. Next, I started on the roof. It was going to be a pyramid shape. The building at this point did not look fancy, especially on the inside, but I would fix it up eventually. While building, I had to remind myself to keep the steel going by constantly refueling the furnace. Following, I wanted to fix the interior a little bit. I stepped outside to gather a lot of surface copper, which I smelted into ingots. Then, I took down the sand walls of my Helve hammer cubby. I moved my outside cellar to the inside of the building. Next, I moved all of the infrastructure from my temporary shelter outside to the inside of my new crib. I then disassembled all of the old ugly structures. Lastly, I grabbed all of the containers and chests and moved my inventory inside as well, nicely sorted by the back wall. Once the move-in was complete, I started working on the copper plates. Once the copper plates were done, I had enough candles to make 8 lanterns, which I evenly spread on the inside. With a warm glow of lanterns and my entire household sorted out, I looked around proudly. Yes, the interior was basic and ugly, but I would fix it up and make it more homely eventually. It was time to start spicing up the build with different colors and textures. My first idea was to use light mud bricks. This required me to finally tap into the blue clay deposit. I had a lot of blue clay to work with and little else to use it on. Then I spent a bit of time digging up the low fertility soil and harvesting the dry grass. Once I had all of the components, I crafted the mud bricks to use in my build. Next was polished stone of different colors. I rented the white section of my desert and started shearing the chalk slabs. I decided to go for 8 slabs of each color. That would roughly translate to 28 stacks of each. I then went to the bauxite region of the desert to get some reds. Next came the black region of my map, but before I could get into quarrying, I got hit by a temporal storm. Once I waited it out, I loaded up on the black slabs. Unfortunately, this rock wasn't deep enough and I had to deal with sand, which slowed down the process a bit. Eventually, I had my inventory filled with 3 new colors. At home, I stacked the slabs in a line for processing. Before I got to chiseling, I harvested another batch of sunflowers and soybeans. I then replanted them for the last time. I was all set on food for the rest of the playthrough. Next, I had to smith a bunch of finishing chisels, but my Helve hammers made quick work of that task. Once I had the chisels, I spent an hour chiseling to get all the polished stone. At least I was all set on building materials for the rest of the playthrough. I started placing the mud bricks as a secondary layer to the front wall. Once I had the mud bricks in place, I placed white stone pillars over them to add extra depth. Then I put black stone as the framing over the door. At this point, I had so much leather that I crafted a full leather set. Drifters was still as annoying as ever, and at least it was some protection. Plus, I would eventually flip this leather suit into a steel chain one. Once I put it on, I got back to the front wall. I added a bit of red and a bit more white, and after mirroring everything to the other side, ended up with something like this. It already looked much more interesting, albeit still a bit flat and one-dimensional. I put some stairs onto the front of the pyramid for a more interesting look and ease of access. The exact same wall and stair design went on the back of the building facing the cliff. Next, I added a few red designs to the windmill and made a hole in the middle. I then chiseled the opening to make it less blocky. I extended the top of the tower all the way to the build limit of my world. The white block was exactly at 255. Meanwhile, another steel batch was done, and I proceeded to start the last batch of my playthrough. Now came a long span of soul-crushing repetition. I had to replicate the tower design on all 4 sides of all 4 towers. This was an exercise in patience, and I was always hurting from the falls. I am a little surprised I didn't die while building this monstrosity. Eventually, everything was copied down to a meticulous detail, and I got working on the sides. I was going to use more mud bricks to accent the wall. In the middle, I wanted to have a window, but with an interesting shape. The middle section would be accented with black color. Meanwhile, I fired up 3 bloomeries worth of quartz to make my first batch of glass for the walls. Once the side wall was layered too deep, I decided to add a 3rd layer for extra depth. I then extended the window shape outwards to give it a more 3D look. I tinkered with the design a little more, and when the bloomeries were done, put the glass into the window. Next, I toyed with the idea of putting pylons on the edges. The pylon design was extremely simplistic, but it still added a little more variety to my desert temple. Once I built my first pylon, I copied the wall design to the other wall. I thought it looked pretty cool already, and this was before any detailing was done. Repetition was the name of the game. I still had 3 more pylons to build on the other side of the temple. I did that until another temporal storm interrupted me, and I hid like a coward as usual. Once the storm passed, I came out to see it raining on the mountain for the first time ever. The temple already looked infinitely cooler with all the additions. However, the pylons looked a bit bulky. So, to reduce their footprint, I chiseled them down a bit. The end result looked a bit slimmer, and I placed the lanterns on top of the pillars. The bulk of the design was now finished, but I still wanted to do a lot of detailing. However, my last batch of steel was nearly done, and I was starting to plan for the Resonance archives. With my last 10 bronze ingot, I made a pickaxe and visited a treasure hunter merchant to get the map of the location. The archives were about 5,000 blocks away, which wasn't the closest, but still manageable. Since I still had a bit of time, I finally got into detailing. First order of business was to chisel the towers a bit. I was going to indent the red designs to create a little more depth. The tops of the towers were going to be smoothed out and the pillars slimmed down to create a more natural transition. Even such small details added a lot of extra interest to the design. Of course, this was not creative, so no copy and paste, and thus I had to repeat this design ad nauseum and add it to every single tower. Once I finished the towers, I wanted to start on steel processing since my 3rd batch was minutes away from being done. I heated up the steel blooms and slapped them on the tin bronze anvil, and nothing happened. I completely forgot about an iron anvil, which I still needed to process this steel. Problem was, I was all out of iron. I had to do one last dive to get another batch. Once I was back, the last steel batch was done. But before I could do anything with that, I had to hammer out the last batch of iron blooms on the Helve hammers. Then I heated up the ingots and hammered out the bottom part of the anvil. Of course, the top part was next. Finally, a little borax between the 2 parts and a bit of hammering, and I was a proud owner of an iron anvil. Now I could finally process the steel blooms, and once all 48 blooms were good to go, I started making steel chain. Once I smithed all of the chains, I crafted my very own set of steel chain armor. In many ways, it was inferior to the Blackguard set that I made in the Arctic Survival, but it was a cool achievement nonetheless. I also made a steel shield and a steel falx. I was almost ready for the Resonance archives. What I didn't have was any healing, and that was an absolute necessity. There was no way I was doing the archives otherwise. Merchants to the rescue one more time. I set off on a lengthy journey to trade. I managed to finally sell my falxes to the treasure hunters along with my old linen bags. The closing merchant bought some leather, which I had a ton of at this point, and the commodities merchant hooked me up with sulfur, saving me potential hours of mining. The other commodities merchant hooked me up with 4 linen sheaths for exactly 12 gears that I had left. Together with honey from the honeycomb that I found in cracked vessels, I managed to craft 16 bandages. I was finally ready for a lengthy journey to the archives. It wasn't particularly eventful, and before long I found the entrance to the archives. I equipped my chain armor and descended down the ladder. Since I had done this before, I didn't waste any time and went straight to the engineering. I stuffed the furnace full of coal and lit it up. This activated the ancient machinery. I then rushed to the bell workshop, only for the bell to give me a run for my money in a huge way. I was struggling to keep the drifters off my back while dishing out reasonable damage to the bell. I spent way more bandages on this fight than I expected. Altogether, I went through 10 bandages, which was a no bueno. I rushed back to engineering, encountering even more resistance on the way, and placed the big green gear in the apparatus. Once again, I knew exactly where to go, and I found the translocator room in a jiffy. I remembered this part being extremely challenging, and I was absolutely on the money. These corridors were full of high-level drifters, locusts, and other nasty surprises. Here, I came close to dying on multiple occasions, including the closest fight I ever had in hardcore. I came within inches of losing the world. I still don't know how much health I dropped to, but it sure looked like 0. I got saved by a weird phasing bug that propelled me through a block. Meanwhile, the Tier 4 drifter lost track of me and went to settle a score with his brethren instead. Honestly, I would have been okay dying here. This desert run was already video worthy. Regardless, I found the pump and made it back to engineering without further incident. Once I touched the pump head, I made it to the library. One problem though, I had only 3 bandages left. Unfortunately, I knew this would be a suicide to fight the boss with so few. I had no choice but to turn around and go back home. So I made another painfully long trek back to my base. I was very close to calling it a day in terms of Resonance archives, but my OCD did not allow me to stop here. Luckily, I picked up a few dozen gears in the archives along with a few linen sheets. I still lacked honey, and my only hope was the single agricultural merchant marked on my map. If he didn't have any honeycomb, it would be game over, but my dude came through. I had enough ingredients to craft 19 bandages. This felt like a fine amount for the final boss. I will let you guess what happened next.
What?
That's right, another 5k run to the archives. Once I made it back, I beelined it straight to the library and jumped down into the dark hole. The boss was just tank and spank. There aren't a lot of ways to outplay him, and by the end, I only had 5 bandages left out of the 19. My hunch about going in with 3 bandages was right. I fired up the library furnace, grabbed the glider plans, and spent a good hour going through the rest of the archives. Once I got the best loot, I made the journey back. I was rocking some spicy new drip and looked like an absolute badass. I still had quite a bit of time left in my 100 days, and I intended to spend most of it working on my temple. I started working on the front first. I extended the white pillar with another layer and started chiseling the pillar into its intended shape. Once I settled on the pillar design, I proceeded to chisel the rest of the pillars. Then I indented the red outline and started working on the small pillar on the top. Next, I put in a second floor on the inside of the building. I never got around to working on the second floor though. I wasn't happy with the front pillars just yet, so I continued working on them until a temporal storm passed through. Since I had glass now, I wanted to make the storm a little more fun and hid behind a glass enclosure to see all the drifters raging. Afterwards, I put in some supporting pillars on the inside of the building. I wanted to chisel them into a more interesting shape, but ultimately ran out of time. I did add a few plant boxes around the pillars. Meanwhile, I finished the front and was generally happy with the result. The extra embellishments and the extra depth added by chiseling really brought the front wall to life. Of course, I had to copy everything to the back wall as well. The side wall looked a bit flat now compared to the front and the back, so I spent a bit of time chiseling out the extra detail. I wasn't sold on the pillar design completely, but since my back was against time, I deemed it good enough. Next, I went out to gather local flora. I gathered a bunch of local cacti, a few flowers, and grabbed all of the cow skulls on the way. I placed some cacti in the wooden sandboxes on the outside of the entrance. I added a few more boxes on the sides as well with different cactus variety. I scattered the skulls by the front and the back entrances. I had a bunch of torch holders, so I placed torches all over the walls on the outside. On the inside, I added a bunch of decorative stuff I had sitting in my chest from all the adventuring. I placed a couple more flower boxes around as well. The inside didn't look as good as I wanted it to, but it didn't look too shabby either. I slept through the night and encountered a foggy morning that was creating a weird ambience around the mountaintop. It was a bit spooky, but also made inspecting my handiwork a bit harder. Regardless, the time was up. I slept for the last time and crossed the 100-day mark once again. And another one in the bag. This felt like a much longer adventure, probably because a million things happened in this playthrough. I made a lot of progress in this world, from a humble beginnings of living with Horus and struggling to break into copper to a full-blown steel age with a massive temple on the mountain. I'm very pleased with how it turned out. The inside is just okay, but the outside looks dope, and it looks even more amazing from the ground below. The desert challenge wasn't nearly as hard as the Arctic challenge, but I had more fun. Probably because it felt a lot more relaxing. Something about living in the land of no bears and no wolves is pretty calming. They are the biggest threats and induce the most anxiety when playing on hardcore. I wanted to do more with the interior of the build, and I could have continued working on the outside as well. Thus, I'm kind of glad I reached a stopping point. Regardless, if you're still here, I love you. Don't forget to do all that YouTube stuff. My next project is a 200 days video for my Plains and Valleys world. But not before a small break from Vintage Story. I think I deserve it, wouldn't you say? And on that note, Oscillascape is beaming out.